Adrian, Donald Trump declaring on social media that he's officially called off trade talks with Canada. It's over an advertisement from Ontario's government that's been playing on American networks.
Leaders in Canada was running ads in the United States on tariffs that took President Reagan's words out of context. Even the Reagan Foundation criticized him for it.
Now, Donald Trump has announced an immediate end to all trade negotiations with Canada because of an advert that criticizes his tariffs on the country.
The sudden suspension of trade talks between the United States and Canada, followed by a dramatic reversal just 72 hours later, stands as one of the most intense and telling moments in modern bilateral diplomacy. On a Monday morning, the Office of the United States Trade Representative issued a maximalist, punitive statement declaring that negotiations with Canada were being paused indefinitely. The language was heavy with a verdict that Canada had failed to demonstrate a good faith commitment, framing the move not as a temporary timeout, but as an aggressive, open-ended pressure tactic meant to force Ottawa into major concessions. Washington expected the Canadian government to sweat under the immense pressure of losing access to its largest trading partner. Yet precisely 72 hours and 14 minutes later, a completely different statement emerged with zero ceremony or explanation, calmly announcing that talks would resume the following week as if the suspension had never happened. This astonishing about-face baffled many inside the Washington Beltway, but the reality of what occurred during those critical 3 days reveals a masterclass in sophisticated economic statecraft. When legendary investor Warren Buffett analyzed the situation, his assessment was both brief and devastating. He noted that while suspending talks is a common aggressive tactic, restarting them a mere 3 days later without a clear explanation reads like a confession. The true question to analyze is not why the Trump administration restarted the talks, but rather what transpired over those 72 hours that made continuing the suspension completely impossible for the American side. The answer lies in the highly coordinated, three-pronged counter-strategy deployed by Canada under the steady hand of Mark Carney, a strategy that targeted international agreements, domestic asset allocation, and the private networks of American capital. To understand why the American pressure tactic collapsed so quickly, one must first look at the core issue that triggered the initial breakdown. For 6 weeks, negotiators had been grinding forward in a deeply dysfunctional format. The American team approached the sessions with a fixed set of non-negotiable demands designed to extract a submission, while the Canadian side offered compromised frameworks and detailed economic modeling intended to build an actual agreement. The breaking point arrived over Canadian dairy market access, a perennial agricultural friction point. Washington demanded an aggressive 23% increase in Canadian dairy import quotas within an 18-month window. Ottawa counterproposed a phased adjustment over 48 months, conditionally tied to reciprocal American agricultural market access measures. When neither side would blink and absorb the domestic political costs, the U.S. attempted to use the ultimate leverage of walking away, operating under the assumption that Canada was completely dependent on American markets and had nowhere else to go. Historically, Canada has sent roughly 76% of its total exports south of the border, a metric the American side frequently cited as absolute proof of Canadian vulnerability. However, Canada had spent the preceding 11 months preparing for exactly this kind of geopolitical disruption. While the vast network of physical pipelines, rail systems, and border facilities cannot be rerouted overnight, a government can rapidly accelerate alternative commercial pathways if it has the strategic green light. Ironically, as long as active negotiations were ongoing, Canada had to show restraint to avoid accusations of negotiating in bad faith. The moment Washington formally suspended the talks, it inadvertently removed that constraint. The suspension gave Canada the political obligation and absolute freedom to activate its diversification playbook. The first countermove occurred within a mere 4 hours of the American announcement. Before making any public media statements or issuing formal diplomatic notes to Washington, the Canadian Agriculture Minister placed a quiet, 31-minute phone call to his counterpart in the European Union. Canada offered up highly sought-after agricultural supply access terms that the EU had been requesting for nearly a year and a half. Because Canada had been holding these terms in reserve to protect its negotiating flexibility with the US, they were immediately ready for deployment. The EU accepted the offer without hesitation, and by late afternoon in Brussels, which was still late morning in Washington, the EU Agricultural Commissioner's Office issued a public press release highlighting expanded trade discussions with Canada. The American trade team was still sitting in their offices processing their own morning suspension when the news crossed the wire that Canada had already secured an alternative agricultural alliance. Simultaneously, the Canadian Finance Ministry executed the second phase of the strategy, targeting global financial markets. Within 6 hours of the suspension, Ottawa released a massive wave of infrastructure investment pre-approvals that had been held in reserve. These projects included 3 major pipeline modifications, 2 expansive Atlantic port terminal upgrades, and a critical mineral processing facility in northern Quebec. Every single one of these projects was specifically oriented toward boosting export capacity to European and Asian markets, totally independent of the United States. This massive injection of certain economic activity sent an immediate shockwave through the trading desks. Standard economic models predicted that the Canadian dollar should have plummeted following a total trade suspension with the US, but instead, the currency held perfectly firm. By demonstrating that Canada possessed alternative global relationships and immediate domestic infrastructure alternatives, the market stabilized, signaling to the world that Canada's economic foundation remained completely unbothered. The third and most decisive move was executed personally by Mark Carney from his private study. Sitting at a desk reserved for unrecorded communications, Carney bypassed the traditional, sluggish diplomatic channels entirely. Instead, he placed 4 direct phone calls to some of the most influential corporate leaders in the United States, individuals whose companies possess massive economic footprints in the specific American states driving the trade restrictions. Carney didn't ask for help, nor did he express any political distress. Operating with the cold, factual precision of a veteran central banker, he simply laid out the exact quarterly earnings impact these newly approved Canadian infrastructure redirections would have on American supply chains. He explained clearly how commercial opportunities that previously flowed into places like Michigan and Ohio would now permanently pivot toward European and Asian partners. Carney gave these business titans a crystal clear look at the hard financial data, knowing they understood the exact political leverage they held. Within 36 hours, those corporate leaders quietly channeled that data directly to key Republican senators and governors, explaining that the continuation of the trade suspension was an economically intolerable self-inflicted wound. Faced with a rising tide of frantic calls from manufacturing associations, farm bureaus, and key political allies whose constituencies were suddenly facing severe financial exposure, the White House was forced into a rapid reassessment. The silence radiating from Washington on Tuesday and Wednesday was the silence of an administration operating under immediate domestic constraint. As Warren Buffett noted, a large nation often possesses immense theoretical leverage, but leverage that cannot be deployed without severely damaging your own domestic economy is not true leverage at all. It is merely an empty threat that exposes its own limitations the moment you try to use it. When the suspension was enacted, instead of Canada weakening, third-party allies moved closer to Ottawa, global markets held steady, and American corporate interests turned up the heat on their own lawmakers. The mathematical reality of the dispute had completely flipped. When talks officially resume next week, the fundamental dynamics in the room will be entirely rewritten. Interestingly, Canada has maintained total official silence regarding its tactical victory. Carney understands that a smaller power gains nothing from publicly humiliating a larger neighbor, as doing so would only force the American side to dig in for domestic political survival. By framing the infrastructure projects as standard domestic policy and the European agreements as natural market diversification, Canada provided Washington with the exact political cover it needed to quietly return to the table under the guise of a rational, routine reassessment. This masterclass in quiet, sophisticated leverage, relying on market signals, rapid structural pivots, and targeted economic realities rather than theatrical political ultimatums, serves as a vital reminder of how quickly global trade dynamics can shift, leaving ordinary investors to bear the brunt of the volatility. If you want to protect your financial future from the cascading effects of trade wars, rising inflation, and sudden market shifts, you need a concrete plan. To help you navigate these turbulent economic waters, I have compiled a comprehensive guide titled The Buffett Blueprint. This specialized blueprint directly applies Warren Buffett's time-tested wealth preservation and investment principles to the modern threats facing your retirement, your 401k, your Social Security, and your fixed income assets. Don't leave your hard-earned savings vulnerable to sudden geopolitical flip-flops and economic statecraft. Click the link located right below this video to claim your copy of the Buffett Blueprint today and start building a real bulletproof protection plan for your retirement this very week.